It's time for me to talk about one of my favorite bands again, Symphony X. There's a lot I could talk about when it comes to Symphony X, and I did a big lesson a few years ago on the riffing style of Michael Romeo, but I want to look at something very different today, Polymeter. This is the Accolade off the Divine Wings of Tragedy, a beautiful Symphony X ballad, and some of my favorite Symphony X songs are ballads. They're really good at writing them. In this section that starts at 7 minutes and 27 seconds, 5 different time signatures get stacked on top of each other in a really extreme example of polymeter. A polymeter is 2 or more meters or time signatures happening at the same time. These meters share a common subdivision, in this case quarter notes. For example, you could have 3 quarter notes against 4 quarter notes. Notice how these get further offset from each other before they line back up again. This is different from a polyrhythm, which in this example would have the 3 and 4 happening in the same amount of time, half note triplets against quarter notes. But we're not talking about polyrhythms here. I'll have to do a separate video on that at some point. In the Accolade, all of these different rhythms are based on the same quarter note pulse, and this is the perfect example to show how polymeters work because each of these new rhythms enter on their own and stack on top of the previous ones. It starts with this 6/4 pattern in the bells. This is pretty straightforward, nothing fancy. One thing to mention is that I'm notating this in 6/4 throughout because the first figure is in 6/4. When it comes to notating polyrhythms in standard music notation, it can be a little tricky, and sometimes you just have to choose a time signature and roll with it. I'll also show how this works with numbers because I think that's probably the easier way to get a grasp on this. After 2 repeats of the first pattern, a tinkly electric piano enters with this pattern in 7/4. This is a 7-note pattern using 8th notes, and I'm doing 2 repeats of this as 1 bar of 7/4 to keep that constant quarter note pulse. Right away you'll hear how these 2 rhythms are playing off of each other. It's a really cool, almost perpetual motion kind of a feel that creates this huge sheet of sound. One other thing that's super important when dealing with polymeters is what's happening harmonically. If polymeters are done with multiple melodic instruments like in this section, they can't be clashing harmonically, which means that usually it's best if the harmony is stagnant, hanging out on one chord or in one key. This entire section is in D minor, and it's really just hanging out on a D minor chord the entire time. This ensures that all of the fighting time signatures on top of each other won't clash harmonically. You can do these type of polyrhythms with more involved harmony, but that requires slightly changing each part to fit the change in harmony, meaning some of the instruments are going to have note changes in the middle of their patterns. In this case, all of the parts are going to remain consistent. Another way to make these polyrhythms work well is to change up the range and timbre of each instrument. Notice how the bells start in the mid-range area and the electric piano is much higher, and that carves out a spot for each of them in the frequency spectrum. Every instrument that gets layered here has a very different sound and timbre. You have orchestral bells, electric piano, violin, acoustic piano, acoustic guitar, bass guitar, and drums. Each one of these sounds is very different, and it makes each one of these different meters easier to pick out. These kind of polymeters don't work as well if it's 5 distorted electric guitars, for example. The different timbre of instruments makes a big difference. The third polymeter enters in this violin melody. This is in 5/4, and the whole melody is 2 bars of 5/4, but the rhythm is the same in both measures. Notice this doesn't start on the downbeat of the 6/4 bar, and that's because each new instrument starts at the beginning of the phrase of the previous instrument, so the violin enters after 2 repeats of the electric piano pattern, just like the electric piano entered after 2 repeats of the bell pattern. Basically, every new instrument becomes the focal point as it enters, and the next instrument's entrance is based off the cycles of the previous instrument's entrance. Think of it as a polymetric pyramid that stacks higher and higher. After the violin comes the acoustic piano, and this is also in 5/4, meaning the violin and acoustic piano line up. So far, it's 6/4 in the bells, 7/4 in the electric piano, and 5/4 in the violin and acoustic piano. Next up is the acoustic guitar, and the pattern here equals 2 bars of 6/4. This starts and lines up with the original bell pattern. Obviously these two parts are very different melodically, but they're going to line up rhythmically at the beginning. Lastly, the drums and bass enter after 2 repeats of the acoustic guitar pattern. There are a couple things happening here. The drums are playing a basic 4/4 rock groove, and the bass is playing a pattern that's 11 quarter notes long. I'll call it 11/4 just to keep it simpler to explain. The drums also hit a splash cymbal every 11 quarter notes to accent the beginning of these bass guitar patterns. Now all of the instruments are playing, and it's time to transition out of this polymetric insanity. And Symphony X does this the way they have this whole entire section by treating the latest instrument that entered as the focal point, and that's the bass and the drums. After 4 repeats of the bass guitar pattern of 11, the whole band comes back together with this figure. In notation, this calls for a bar of 2/4 for the 11 pattern to finish off, but honestly it's not super important as the bass guitar pattern is what is cueing the exit from this section. But what about the rest of the time signatures happening here? All of the other instruments keep looping their patterns until the moment everything syncs up. And in this case, everything besides the bass has their patterns get cut short so that everything syncs up together. I'm going to play this entire section 3 times. The first will be with music notation, and I'll indicate where the new instruments enter and what their patterns are. The second and third times will be with just numbers, the second without a metronome, and the third with a metronome. And I'll indicate the time signatures of each instrument. This will better show how these different patterns are cycling around each other. There's 5 time signatures at once in the incredible music of Symphony X. This is obviously very complicated, but it's a really cool sound that creates a very unique texture. And even if you only combine 2 or 3 meters together, polymeters can still pack a powerful punch. Definitely worth exploring in your own music. And if you enjoyed this lesson, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share. Till next time, stay proggy.